Here's a sentence I didn't expect to say about Oregon. There's a town in this state where whenever the tide pulls back, the beach in front of it reveals an ancient ghost forest. And that's not even the weirdest place on this list, because Oregon has places that look completely harmless on the surface. A small town, a river stop, a quiet main street, a stretch of high desert so still it feels like nothing could possibly happen there. But the closer you look, the more each place seems to be hiding something slightly off from normal. A bridge with a name that sounds like it came out of a myth. A downtown that completely changes identity every Halloween season. A town so small you could easily miss it, but with a rodeo so big the whole region knows its name. And the strangest part is, all of these places are real. Not internet legends, not exaggerated local stories. And by the end of this video, there's a good chance you'll realize Oregon is a lot less quiet than it looks. Quiet. Then, number 10, Neskowin. Here's something strange about the Oregon coast. There's a tiny beach town called Neskowin where the most unsettling thing isn't in a museum, isn't behind glass, and isn't even fully visible most of the time. It's under your feet. Now, on the surface, Neskowin looks completely harmless. Small coastal community, quiet streets, beach houses, one of those places people go when they want to disappear for a weekend and pretend their inbox does not exist. It's calm, scenic, and honestly kind of sleepy in the best possible way. If you drove through it too fast, you'd probably think, nice beach town, good place to read a book, maybe drink coffee and stare at the ocean for a while. End of story, except it's not. Because when the tide drops low enough, the beach starts revealing something that looks deeply wrong. Out of the sand come these dark, ancient tree stumps, spread across the shoreline like the remains of a forest that should not be there anymore. People call it the ghost forest, which, to be fair, is exactly what it looks like. Not driftwood, not random debris, an actual buried forest. And these trees are old, really old. We're talking around 2,000 years old. Long before vacation homes, long before the highway, long before anybody thought of Neskowin as a peaceful little escape, there was a living forest standing right here. Then the coast changed. The easy version is this: some major natural event, likely tied to the region's violent geological history, killed the forest and buried it under sand and seawater. And for centuries, it just stayed there, hidden. Then storms in the late 1990s stripped away enough sand for the stumps to reappear. And suddenly, this quiet beach town had something most places do not have: physical proof that the land beneath it has a much older story than it lets on. And that's what makes Neskowin weird. Not loud weird, not neon sign weird, quiet weird. The kind that sneaks up on you. Because this place does not look haunted. It looks relaxing. That's almost worse. Most beach towns sell you sunsets, salt air, and maybe some overpriced ice cream. Neskowin gives you all that too. It just also happens to have a 2,000-year-old dead forest rising out of the sand when the ocean feels like giving up the secret. And once you see that, this town stops feeling ordinary very fast. Number 9. Newport. Here's what makes Newport strange. It is not some abandoned ghost town. It is not hiding a cursed legend in the woods. It is a completely functioning coastal city with fishing boats, seafood counters, working docks, tourists on the boardwalk, and the smell of salt and chowder hanging in the air. On paper, Newport is one of the bigger coastal communities in Oregon, with a population a little over 10,000, a real port economy, and a bayfront that feels busy in a very normal, very everyday kind of way. And then the dock starts barking. That is the weird part, because right along Newport's historic bayfront, near Port Dock 1, there's a stretch where sea lions regularly haul themselves out onto the floating docks and act like they pay rent there. Not one or two, whole loud, heavy, smelly piles of them. They shove each other, bark over each other, fight for space, roll around like oversized wet tourists, and somehow steal the scene from an entire working waterfront. Local tourism guides even point out that you usually hear them before you see them, which feels accurate. because the sound hits first like somebody turned the volume up on the ocean itself. And that is why Newport works so well on a list like this. The town itself is not trying to be weird. It is just living its life. Boats still come and go, people still buy fresh seafood, shops stay open. Visitors walk the bayfront like any normal coastal destination. But hanging right there in the middle of it all is this chaotic animal subplot that nobody can ignore. Most of the regulars here are California sea lions, and some of the males can grow huge, several feet long and weighing hundreds of pounds. So this is not some cute little aquarium moment. These are massive animals sprawled across public view, grunting and glaring like they have been appointed unofficial harbor supervisors. Honestly, Newport feels like the kind of place where the human town and the animal town accidentally merged and nobody ever bothered to separate them again. That is what makes it memorable. Newport is normal right up to the edge of the water, then suddenly the dock turns into a wildlife stage and the sea lions act like they were here first. And the weird thing is, they kind of have a point. Number 8. Cascade Locks. Here's a strange detail most people do not expect from a tiny town in Oregon. There is a place called Cascade Locks where the bridge beside town is not just called the Bridge of the Gods for dramatic effect. That name comes with an old native story about mountains, rivalry, and a crossing so legendary it sounds less like local history and more like something out of a myth. And that is what makes Cascade Locks interesting, because on the surface, this place looks completely manageable. Small population, quiet streets, boats on the Columbia, hikers passing through, and the kind of river town atmosphere that feels calm, almost to the point of disappearing into the scenery. With only around 1,400 residents, it is easy to treat Cascade Locks like a quick stop in the gorge instead of somewhere you would ever think of as strange. But then you see the bridge, and suddenly the whole place feels a little different. Not because the structure itself is bizarre. It is a real toll bridge, functional, familiar, built to connect Oregon and Washington. The weird part is the name hanging over it, because once you hear Bridge of the Gods, the town stops sounding like a roadside stop and starts sounding like it is sitting inside a story much older than itself. According to regional accounts and native legend, there was once a great natural bridge across the Columbia River. In some versions of the story, powerful mountain figures, now associated with Mount Hood and Mount Adams, fought over a woman named Lewit, and the conflict ended with that bridge collapsing. Which means this quiet little town is standing next to a place where the landscape was remembered, not just as scenery, but as drama. And here is the part that makes it even better. There may be a real geological memory behind the myth. Historians and geologists have linked the story to the Bonneville landslide, a massive event around the 15th century that crashed into the Columbia and temporarily changed the river in a way that could easily have lived on in oral tradition. So the legend did not just float in from nowhere, the land itself may have helped create it. That is why Cascade Locks works. It is not loud weird. It is not gimmick weird. It is a very small river town living beside a bridge whose name carries the weight of an old world story. And once you know that, the town feels much bigger than it looks. Number 7, Sumpter. Here's something you do not expect from a town with barely a couple hundred people. In Sumpter, Oregon, you can stand next to a giant old gold dredge, watch people pan for gold, and then hop on a heritage train where a staged robbery might break out like nobody ever told this town the Wild West ended. And that is not branding exaggeration. That is basically how Sumpter works. Because on the surface, Sumpter is tiny. Census figures put it at just over 200 residents, which means by modern standards, this place is almost small enough to miss if you blink at the wrong moment. But that number hides the strange part. Sumpter used to be one of Eastern Oregon's real mining boomtowns. In its peak years, it had thousands of people, electric lights, saloons, newspapers, rail connections, and the kind of energy towns only get when everybody thinks there is still gold in the ground and maybe one more lucky strike waiting around the corner. Most towns like that either disappear or turn into quiet little history markers. Sumpter did something weirder. It built its present-day identity around not fully leaving the gold rush behind. The biggest example is the Sumpter Valley Dredge, this enormous industrial machine that still sits out there like a leftover beast from another century. Oregon State Parks says it operated almost nonstop from 1935 to 1954 and recovered more than $4 million in gold at the prices of that time. It is not just a museum piece. It is a reminder that this whole valley was once chewed up, sifted, and reworked in the search for gold, and the land still shows it. Travel Oregon even points out that the surrounding tailings are still visible across the area, which means the gold rush did not just leave behind stories, it left scars. And then there is the part that makes Sumpter feel almost theatrical. Visitors can still try gold panning here, and the Sumpter Valley Railroad runs special events including train robbery reenactments. That means this is one of those rare places where history is not just explained to you on a plaque, it gets replayed in front of you like the town refuses to let the past settle down. That is why Sumpter stands out. It is not weird because it is haunted or mysterious. It is weird because it is a very small modern town that still behaves like the gold rush might start back up any minute, and honestly, that is a hard vibe to fake. Number 6. Gold Hill. Here's the kind of sentence that immediately makes a town more interesting. Near Gold Hill, Oregon, there is a place where people will casually show you balls rolling uphill, heights changing for no good reason, and a crooked little house that makes your body feel like gravity forgot the assignment. And somehow this has been part of the area's identity since 1930. Now, Gold Hill itself does not exactly look like a place where reality should start acting strange. It is a small southern Oregon town in the Rogue Valley, a little over 1,300 people, the kind of place that feels more connected to river views, outdoor recreation, and quiet local life than anything paranormal. On paper, it is just a normal small town, which is exactly why the weirdness lands so well. Because just outside town sits the Oregon Vortex and the House of Mystery, one of those classic roadside places where you walk in expecting a gimmick and walk out going, okay, I still do not fully like what my eyes just did in there. Travel Oregon describes it as a place of visual and perceptual phenomena, which is a very polite way of saying the whole thing feels a little off in the best possible way. People go there to watch simple objects behave strangely, to stand in spots where one person suddenly looks taller than the other and then switch places and watch the illusion flip, and to step inside a tilted structure where your balance starts negotiating with your brain. And that is really the genius of Gold Hill on a list like this. The town itself is not overplaying the mystery, it is not all neon aliens and haunted gift shops. The weirdness is nearby, sitting there like a long-running local question mark. Not fully supernatural, not fully explainable in a satisfying way if you were just standing there experiencing it, and definitely strange enough to keep people talking. Oregon Encyclopedia even places it in the long American tradition of mystery spots. Those roadside attractions built around the feeling that the normal rules are slipping just a little. Honestly, that might be what makes it work. Gold Hill feels ordinary right up until your senses stop cooperating. And once that happens, even the normal parts of town start to feel a little suspicious. Number 5. Yachats. Here's a sentence that sounds exaggerated until you actually see it. Near the tiny Oregon coast town of Yachats, there is a hole in the rocks where the Pacific Ocean can look like it is draining straight into the earth. Not metaphorically, not poetically. Visually, that is what it looks like. And once you see it, the whole town starts feeling a little less normal. Now, Yachats itself is about as calm as a coastal town can get. It is small with a population of just under 1,000, and Oregon tourism sources describe it as tiny and tranquil, which feels right. This is the kind of place people go for quiet walks, coffee, ocean air, and maybe the comforting illusion that nothing dramatic is supposed to happen there. On the surface, Yachats feels peaceful, slow, and almost suspiciously gentle. But then you get to Cape Perpetua near Cook's Chasm, and suddenly the coastline starts behaving like it belongs in another category entirely. That is where you find Thor's Well, a collapsed sea cave or coastal sink-like feature in basalt, where waves surge in, explode upward, and then pour back down into the opening. Travel Oregon describes it as a place where the raging Pacific seems to drain into a bottomless pit at high tide, which honestly sounds dramatic until the water starts moving, and you realize that might actually be the most accurate description available. And that is what makes Yachats work so well on a list like this. The town itself is not weird in some loud or gimmicky way. It is not covered in mystery signs or trying to sell you a legend. It is just quietly sitting next to one of the strangest visual phenomena on the Oregon coast. A place so serene it almost lulls you into relaxing right before the ocean starts looking like it has a drain. The best time to see Thor's Well is around an hour before high tide, when the hole is visible and the incoming water starts doing the thing people come for, but there is a reason official sources keep warning visitors to be careful. The area is dangerous with strong currents, sneaker waves, and no railings to save you if you get too confident, which somehow makes the whole thing even stranger. It is beautiful, mesmerizing, and just unsafe enough to remind you that the Pacific is not performing for your entertainment. That is Yachats, a peaceful little town beside a coastline that occasionally looks like the ocean is trying to disappear. Number 4. St. Helens. Here's the weird thing about St. Helens, Oregon. For most of the year, it looks like a perfectly normal river town. Then October shows up and the place basically changes costumes, turns its downtown into a Halloween set, and leans into the whole thing so hard that it starts feeling less like a seasonal festival and more like the town has temporarily switched realities. And the strangest part is that is not an exaggeration. St. Helens really does host a month-long Spirit of Halloween Town celebration tied to the Disney movie that was filmed there. St. Helens is not some tiny novelty village built around one gimmick. It is a real city of about 13,800 people sitting along the Columbia River doing normal city things the rest of the year. On paper, nothing about that sounds especially strange, which is exactly why the Halloween transformation hits harder. Because once fall rolls in, downtown stops acting like downtown, acting like, according to the official event site, Spirit of Halloween Town runs from late September through October, turning the center of St. Helens into what they openly describe as a Halloween wonderland. And this is not just a few pumpkins on a sidewalk. The event includes haunted attractions, parades, costume contests, live entertainment, celebrity appearances, and the whole nostalgia factor of people showing up because this is where Halloween Town was filmed in the first place. Travel Portland describes it the same way, Halloween all October long. That is such a strange identity for a town to fully commit to. Most places decorate for the season. St. Helens more or less auditions to become Halloween. And honestly, you kind of have to respect that level of commitment because there is something very funny about a quiet river town deciding that every fall it is going to stop being ordinary and spend a month behaving like spooky season is a civic responsibility. At that point, Halloween is not a holiday anymore, it is local policy. That is why St. Helens stands out. It is not weird because of some buried legend or impossible natural phenomenon. It is weird because it has figured out how to become a different version of itself on purpose. A normal river town for most of the year, and then, for one stretch every fall, something much closer to a real-life Halloween town. Number 3. Joseph. Here's a weird contrast you do not expect in a mountain town this small. Joseph, Oregon looks like the kind of place built for postcards. Big mountain backdrop, quiet streets, a little over 1,000 residents, and the kind of scenery that makes even a grocery run feel a little cinematic. On paper, it should read like a classic Eastern Oregon escape, the sort of town where people come for lakes, trails, cabins, and maybe a slower pulse for a couple of days. And to be fair, it is that. But that is not the strange part. The strange part is that Joseph does not just feel like a mountain town, it also feels like an outdoor bronze gallery that somehow ended up in the middle of cowboy country. Walk through downtown and you start noticing it almost immediately. Large bronze sculptures on Main Street, galleries that do not feel tacked on or touristy. And not far from all of that, a real foundry where artists' ideas are turned into cast bronze. Travel Oregon calls Joseph the state's first art and cultural district, which is a pretty unusual title for a place most people would assume is all about wilderness and wide-open views. The town itself is beautiful in a very expected way. Mountains behind it, Wallowa Lake nearby, outdoor adventure all around. Nothing weird about that. But then the art side starts taking over. The official Joseph site highlights a bronze art walk right on Main Street with 7 monumental bronze sculptures, and Travel Oregon points to Valley Bronze as a major part of the town's identity, complete with a gallery and foundry tours where visitors can actually see how the work gets made. And honestly, that is a very specific kind of strange, because most small mountain towns lean hard into flannel, fishing, and frontier nostalgia. Joseph looked at all that stunning wilderness and said, yes, absolutely. But what if we also made bronze sculpture part of the local personality? Not as a side note, not as one nice gallery on the corner, as a real visual identity. It does not feel weird because something supernatural happened there. It feels weird because the place looks like one kind of town and behaves like another, a scenic little mountain town, yes, but also a place where public art and foundry culture are woven so deeply into the streets that it starts to feel like the whole town is curating itself. And that is a pretty rare thing to find at the edge of the wilderness. Number 2, Silver Lake. Near Silver Lake, Oregon, there is a giant crack in the earth more than 2 miles long and up to about 70 feet deep. Not a dramatic nickname, not a metaphor, an actual volcanic fissure in the ground. And once you know that, it becomes very hard to think of Silver Lake as just another quiet desert town. Now, Silver Lake itself is tiny. We are talking about a community of well under 200 people out in Oregon's high desert, the kind of place that feels quiet even by small town standards. Dry landscape, long open stretches, very little noise, and the kind of remoteness that makes everything feel a little farther away than it probably is. On the surface, this is not a town that looks like it should come with some giant geological plot twist. That is exactly why the plot twist works. Because not far from town, the ground just opens up. That is crack in the ground, an ancient volcanic fissure that cuts through the desert like the land got split open and never fully recovered. It is not a canyon carved by a river. That is part of what makes it feel so strange. It is narrower, more abrupt, more like a tier than a valley. Travel Oregon describes it as more than 2 miles long and up to 70 feet deep. And the Bureau of Land Management notes that it has stayed visible in part because this region is so dry. In other words, in a wetter place, time might have softened it by now. Out here, the desert just kept the wound open. And honestly, that is a pretty unsettling visual for such a quiet place. Silver Lake is not weird because it is busy. It is weird because it is the opposite. Everything about the town feels still, sparse, and ordinary right up until you realize one of its nearby landmarks looks like the earth glitched. You can even hike along parts of the fissure, which somehow makes it stranger, because now you're not just looking at this giant crack from a distance. You are walking beside it like it is a completely normal feature of the neighborhood. That is why Silver Lake stands out. It is a very small desert town living next to something that looks almost apocalyptic. And the weirdest part is, out there it somehow still feels quiet. Number 1. St. Paul. Here's a weird small town equation that should not really work, but somehow does. St. Paul, Oregon is tiny. We are talking about a town with only a few hundred residents. And yet every summer, this little place hosts a rodeo so big, so established, and so deeply baked into its identity that the event feels larger than the town itself. In fact, St. Paul Rodeo openly brands itself as the nation's greatest 4th of July rodeo, which is either a very bold slogan or the kind of confidence you earn after doing something right for a very long time. And that is what makes St. Paul strange. Because if you just looked at the town on paper, nothing about it would suggest national-level rodeo energy. This is not a major city. It is not some giant tourism machine. It is a very small Oregon community Quiet most of the year, the kind of place a lot of people would drive past without realizing it carries one of the most famous rodeo traditions in the region. But then, late June rolls around, the calendar starts leaning toward the 4th of July, and suddenly St. Paul stops feeling small. The rodeo runs for 5 days, usually from around June 30th through July 4th, and it is not just one event dropped into a small town. It is more like the town temporarily expands into something much bigger than itself. Rodeo performances, carnival rides, vendors, a parade, fireworks, live entertainment. This is the kind of celebration that pulls in crowds many times larger than the local population. Reports tied to the event place attendance around 75,000 over 5 days, with grandstands seating roughly 10,500 people. That is a wild ratio when your hometown population is only a few hundred. And this is not some recent viral success story either. St. Paul Rodeo dates back to 1936, which means this town has had generations to build around it, shape itself through it, and let the event become part of how the place is understood. It is PRCA sanctioned, and it was inducted into the Pro Rodeo Hall of Fame in 2023. So this is not just local pride talking. The rodeo actually carries real weight in the larger rodeo world. That is why St. Paul lands so well at number 1. It is not weird because of a mystery or a legend. It is weird because the scale feels off in the most interesting possible way. A town small enough to miss on the map. A rodeo too big to miss in real life. And once you see that contrast, St. Paul stops feeling small almost immediately. Sure, Oregon has the postcard version everyone expects. Forests, coastline, mountains, small towns, all of that. But once you look a little closer, you start realizing some of these places are carrying something much stranger. A ghost forest buried under the sand, a town that turns into Halloween Town every fall, a quiet desert community sitting next to a massive crack in the earth, and a tiny town whose rodeo somehow feels bigger than the town itself. That is what makes Oregon so interesting. It is not weird in one loud, obvious way. It is weird in layers. Sometimes the strangest places are the ones that look the most normal at first glance. So now I want to ask you, which town surprised you the most? And more importantly, which one would you actually want to visit first? If you enjoyed this video, hit like, subscribe, and stick around, because there are a lot more towns across America that look ordinary on the map and get a whole lot stranger once you get there.